Take your Bibles and turn to Mark 5. Mark 5. Before we start, I'd like to just say a couple of things. One is look around. Look around this room. Do you see a lot of space in the pews? You do? Don't let that worry you. A full church is never a sign of a healthy church. Can you hear me? Is this on? A packed house is never the sign of a healthy church that God is blessing. Our American culture has said that bigger is better and that God blesses the masses. You read the scriptures over and over again and you'll see that Jesus often would say, as he is in a moment, going to say, now don't tell anybody about this. So crowds are never a sign of God's favor. Never. Sometimes God blesses a crowd. But look around. I'm not worried about this. This is just fine with me. The fewer the better, as far as I'm concerned. Less work. The second thing I wanted to say is, yesterday I went to the Continental Divide Association meeting down at Crossroads Church in Poncha Springs. You don't know this maybe, but Dan Ehlers is our moderator for our association. And yesterday was the first meeting that he moderated and did a remarkable job. And I think you should make him feel very uncomfortable by bragging about it every time you get a chance. One of the things I've learned about Dan Ehlers is if you brag on him or thank him or give him a compliment, it makes his it makes his skin crawl. So if you really love Dan, let's just do that a lot, okay? He gave a devotion yesterday about love and what love should be in the church, and it really touched my heart. I'm going to ask him to share that with you this morning. So Dan would... No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure you do. It's really, really good. So thank you, Dan. Made me proud yesterday. Also, one last announcement. When we do the corporate prayer, when I come back up here and I pray for things and then open it up for you, and there's so much silence, don't let that bother you either. I don't know if you've been to very many churches, but a whole lot of churches will not allow silence to be a part of the worship experience. It's loud when they come in, and it's loud when they leave. Do you know that the song that we sang, Be Still, you cannot be still if you're being loud. So don't ever worry about so much silence in a worship service. Let it be. Let God talk to you in the silence. Okay, Mark 5. Are you there? Mark 5? All right. Verse 21. Mark 5, verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogues named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." So he went with him. A large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She'd endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She'd heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Now, while he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child's not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement, and he strictly ordered them that no one should know this. And then he told them, "Get her something to eat." This is the word of the Lord. Jesus clearly works on a different schedule than the rest of us like to work. His routine, his day-to-day operations is different than ours. Instead of there being Eastern Standard Time with Jesus, there's Eternal Standard Time. And what that means is that Jesus never arrives late and he never arrives early. He's always on time. Always. Now, in these two stories, story within a story, he stops to deal with a woman who has a chronic problem. And while he's dealing with a woman with a chronic problem, a young girl with an acute problem dies. Now you stop and think about that for a second. Chronic means it's been going on for how long? A long time. Acute means what? Now. So there's an urgency to the little girl's problem, but not as big of an urgency for the woman's problem. Does that make sense? And so as Jesus is moving towards the town where Jairus is from, he's interrupted by this woman who has a long-term problem, and he stops on his journey to deal with her. Now, if you're Jairus and you know that life is leaving your little 12-year-old girl's body, that she could die at any minute, so time is of the essence. Hurry, Jesus. And Jesus stops and turns around to look at the crowd. And then he asks, "Who touched me?" And then he engages in a conversation with a woman who does not have an urgent problem. If you're Jairus, how are you feeling about right now? Are you kind of wanting this to wrap up? Are you wanting things to move along? Are you wondering why Jesus is spending so much time here when your daughter is at death's door? And then you hear, while he's been talking with this woman, your little girl dies. How do you feel? How do the disciples feel? How does anybody feel? Jesus will not be hurried. He's talking, but he's taking his time. And everything that Jairus feared would happen, happened. And I think you can imagine. But Jesus turns to Jairus and looks him in the eye, I think, and maybe with a smile says, "Trust me." God's sense of timing always confounds us. His blessing never seems to come when we want it. His grace never operates according to our schedule or our timing. So in the time that remains, I want to give you lessons from the life at the speed of Jesus. And there are 3 of them. Lessons from the life of the speed of Jesus. Here's number 1. You will always give Jesus and get from Jesus more than you bargained for. You will always give to Jesus and get from Jesus more than you ever bargained for. If you look at this story, Jairus came to Jesus for a cure for a fever. That's what he came for. Would you come? My daughter has a fever. You could lay hands on her and cure her fever. What Jairus got was a resurrection. You with me? He came for a fever and got a resurrection. That's a better story. When you think about this, this great physician, Jesus, looks right into his eyes and says, "Trust me." And that was a test of faith. He'd come to trust Jesus for a cure for fever, and he ends up finding out that his daughter dies, and he has to trust Jesus for more. He has to give Jesus more of his trust. The woman wanted to just sneak in the crowd and touch his garment, maybe get a healing, and then run away. That's what she wanted. But she got more than she bargained for. Jesus won't have any of that. Touch me and then sneak away. He forces her to go public. She didn't want to do that. So for the woman, this is a very threatening thing. Because of the blood that was issuing from her body, she was ceremonially unclean. In that culture, that was just an unheard of thing. You could not participate in many of the social things. She was probably considered a cursed person because everything she tried medically did not work to stop the issue of blood. And so that probably meant, in conventional thinking, that God had cursed her. For her to touch a rabbi in public was an enormous taboo. Therefore, it is a very frightening thing when Jesus turns around and says to the crowd, "Who touched me?" So, why did Jesus bring her out of the crowd? Why did he ask that question wanting to put a spotlight on her, this unclean woman? Well, she needed it. And it's a lot more than she wanted to give. Are you still with me? She wanted to sneak in, touch, and run. But she ended up giving a lot more. She gave a public disclosure of her problem. She's going to get a lot more than she bargained for, though. See, she's a quasi-superstitious understanding of what Jesus was able to do. There's a superstitious nature to what she's doing. She's just sneaking in thinking, if I could just touch the tassel on his robe, like rubbing Aladdin's lamp, if I could just touch the rabbit foot, if I could just touch the garment. That's sort of a superstitious approach to this. But Jesus' whole point here was to get her out there so he can, with his actions and with his words, say, it is faith that healed you. That's the difference between, in the world, between a semi-superstitious faith and a faith that goes down into your soul. You came here with that kind of a superstitious faith for a body healing, but you will become a life-transformed disciple of mine for eternity. See what Jesus is saying? He's saying to her and he's saying to us, don't just come to me to have your needs met. Don't just come to me to have your bills paid, for the cancer to go away. Don't just come to me for your marriage to get well. Don't just come to me to have your needs met. Come to me for a life-transforming relationship. Come to me for that and see what else I'll do. See what else I'll do. Even if I don't do anything else for you, you've got a life-transforming relationship with the Son of the living God. That's worth something. Well, that's far more than she expected to get. It's also a lot more than she expected to give. If you go to Jesus for anything, and I hope you do, go to Him for Him. Go to Him to get Him. Not what He gives. And then see what He gives. That's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2. God's grace reverses the values of the world. God's grace reverses the values of the world. Jairus is a man in a man's world. This is a woman in a man's world. In that day and time, men had all the power. In this day and time, in that place, men still have most of the power. Lynette pointed this out. I didn't notice this, but she said it on Wednesday, that when we were in Israel just a month or so ago, when she would walk down a sidewalk, the men would not get out of her way. In this country, when a woman walks down the sidewalk, at least that's what Lynette says, most of the time they'll defer to her. But in Israel, they didn't do that. She had to step out of their way so that they could pass. It's a man's world, then and now. Jairus is a man. She's just a woman. Grace is inverting all of these values. Jairus is a synagogue leader. This woman is ceremonially unclean, which meant she hasn't worshiped in years in a place of worship. This man is almost certainly rich. This woman has spent everything on every quack cure she could find. She's poor. This man is at the top of the social food chain. This woman is at the bottom of the social food chain. Yet Jesus turns to the woman who's a nobody and deals with her while the man is standing there waiting for his greatest need to be met. He has to wait while Jesus deals with this poor, unclean, social outcast woman. Are you following what I'm showing you here? Now, whenever that happens, and it happens a lot in the Bible, it's the outsider who seems to get Jesus' attention more than the insider does. The outsider. The socially misfit. The spiritually outcast. Seems to capture Jesus' heart and his imagination. And the reason that Jesus seems to connect to the outsiders, because that's how grace works. That's how the gospel works. Jesus knows that the way up is to go down. The way to get power is to give power away and to serve. The way to be clothed in absolute righteousness of God is to recognize that you are naked before God on your own merit. The way to have a great life is to give that life away. The way to have a fulfilled life is to seek the fulfillment and the happiness of another person. The way to know who you are is to stop trying to figure out who you are, but love God with all your heart and serve fellow man. And then you'll find out who you are. That reverses the values. See, Jesus does not come to people based on pedigree. Grace is why pimps and prostitutes flocked to Jesus. Because they understood that their past didn't keep them from a life with God. But that's also why the priests and the pious had a hard time with Jesus. because their past didn't get them any special favors with God. Nobody is disqualified, and nobody is good enough for the life with God. God's grace can only be given to us. The fact that this woman's quasi-superstitious faith, it's even a lower level faith than what Jairus had. Her faith was even less than his. And yet it seems as if Jesus is drawn to people who are the most messed up and who mess up the most. And I don't know how that lands with you, but I am very grateful that that's how he operates. That's good news for Joe Chambers. And I know some of your stories. It's really good news for some of you too. That he seems to be attracted to those of us who have nothing to offer him. That's how grace is. Lessons from the life at the speed of Jesus is grace inverts and changes the values of the world. Third one is this. God's delays indicate he knows something that is hidden from you and I. Let me say that again. God's delays indicates that he knows something that you and I cannot see or could never comprehend. Are you with me still? As far as Jairus and the disciples are concerned, what Jesus is doing is malpractice. You know that. If an emergency room doctor has a person who has a chronic problem and spends time with that chronic problem, and the person with the acute problem dies, do you know what happens? The doctor gets sued. The hospital gets sued for malpractice. And as far as they're able to see, Jairus and the disciples, Jesus is practicing in his miracles in a very bad way. His priorities are out of whack. The woman could have waited 2 hours while Jesus dealt with the urgent issue of the young girl with the fever. But he doesn't. You and I know something that the folks in this story don't know. Here's 2 things that we know that they don't know. Number 1, a fever and death are not a problem for Jesus. One's not any harder than another. Yes? If he's the Son of the living God, raising someone from the dead or curing a fever, one's not going to tax him any more than another. So that's hidden from them. That's clearly evident to us. Second, there's an opportunity to take this quasi-superstitious woman and turn her into a lifelong disciple and apprentice of Christ. They didn't know that, but that's what happened here in this story. Look in verse 33 in the Bible that's open on your lap. The woman, knowing that what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And as Jerry, after our Bible study on Wednesday night, pointed out to me, that little phrase, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease," could be translated, "Go in peace and be saved." Go in peace and have that is wrong with your soul put back together. See, she received salvation as well as a healed body. They could not have known that. I can see it. You can see it. Jerry can see it. But they could not see it. So here's a question for you. Is it possible that God is delaying something in your life? I don't know what it would be. It could be almost anything. Are you about ready to give up? Do you find yourself kind of going, if God doesn't come through pretty quick, I'm just going to take matters into my own hands, do it myself? Are you angry at God about that? When is he going to come through? Maybe Jesus is looking at you and saying, there's something about this situation that you could not see, and even if you could not understand. And I'm going to ask you to trust me. Could he be saying that to you? There's something about this situation that has got you so wound up that you cannot see. And even if you could, you cannot understand. Trust me. 20 years ago, Lynette and I were living in Lakewood, Colorado. Actually Littleton, but served a church in Lakewood. And I was invited to speak at a denominational meeting over in Grand Junction. And so they paid for us to go over and put us up in a hotel. And I gave my little talk. And she and I both had been kicking around the idea that life in the big city with our young family was a little bit harried. It was a little bit out of control. It was spinning those plates on the sticks that, that you used to watch Ed Sullivan's show do, It just felt that way. So on the drive over, we thought, wouldn't it be nice if we just kind of did a little tour of the state of Colorado? And I found out where some pastoralist churches were in the West. And so after the speaking engagement in Grand Junction, we did this little tour. We stopped in Delta, looked at a little church there, stopped in Montrose, looked at a little church there, stopped in Silverton, looked at a little church there. Ouray, looked there. Pagosa Springs. Drove over to Alamosa. Beautiful little Baptist churches. None of them had any spiritual compellingness. And so we went back to Denver. Then we moved to the Pacific Northwest for 15 years. God just seemed to say, that's not going to happen. And then I got to move to the most beautiful little town in all of Colorado. Right here. He delayed a request. He didn't say no. He said, not yet. Not yet. I don't know, are you sometimes we get in such a hurry to have God answer our questions right now. Answer our requests right now. And he's just saying, trust me. Trust me. You know I'm telling the truth on this. You have this perspective. You remember when your kids were little? How many of you remember when your kids were like the age of Wyatt and Jackson and these guys? The real little kids. You remember that? Or your grandkids? And they wanted something when? Now. And you're thinking, you have an adult perspective that they don't have, right? Think about that from an eternity's perspective. Last thing. There's something in here that's bothered me since we studied it Wednesday night, Jerry. It's verse 30. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Now the reason that bothers me is because it's the only place in the gospel where you have an example of Jesus feeling power leaving his body. It's the only place in the gospel where you see that the God of the universe who created everything feels a power depletion. How could Jesus feel a power depletion? How can omnipotence feel a power depletion? One of the reasons why this is so unique is that Jesus has dealt with bigger problems with this and didn't seem to have any problems at all. You turn back in your Bible a little bit and Jesus is dealing with a hurricane-force storm on the Sea of Galilee. And all he says to that storm is, shh, smooth as glass. He gets off the boat and there's this man who's filled with demons, an army of demons, a legion of demons. And he just, without even breaking a sweat, stops it, drives them into the pigs and the pigs into the sea. Bigger issues. But this woman touches him and, hey, who touched me? What is up with that? Here's what I think. I think it was a sign that was pointing to something else. I think it was a clue, a sign that was pointing to something else. And I'll show you what I mean. Now, verse 34 said, he said to her, daughter. Do you remember that? Circle that word daughter. How old is Jesus? Come on. 31, 2, or 3. Safe. All right. Certainly not old enough to be her father. But he calls her daughter. The very next sentence, Mark tells us that he goes on with Jairus to see his daughter. See it in verse 35? While he was still speaking, some people came to the leader's house and said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Overhearing this, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And then when they got to the house, there's all kinds of mourning. The professional mourners had already gotten there. There was weeping and gnashing of teeth. There was a whole lot of commotion. And Jesus just makes this little announcement to everybody that was there. She's not dead. She's just asleep. And they laugh at him. And he shushes them all out of the house, takes Peter and James and John and the mother and the father into the house. And then he just takes the mother and the father into the room where the little girl is laying on the bed. And he says 2 words to them. First word, Talitha. In your Bible, it'll even tell you what the translation is. Little girl. But the commentaries I read said this. It's not just little girl. It's a diminutive. It's a word that is often used for a pet name. It has a parental tone to it. One translation translates it, honey. Honey. First word. Second word is cum. It translates get up. But it's the same kind of word that would be used if a little girl is asleep on a sunny morning and mom or dad comes in and sits down on the edge of her bed and takes her by the hand and says, honey, get up. And it's a tender word. It's a gentle word. It's time to get up. What does this mean? Jesus comes to this little girl and says, honey, wake up. And she does. This is power. He is facing death, the greatest enemy of mankind. More powerful than a hurricane, more powerful than a legion of demons, more power than an issue of blood. He's facing our greatest enemy. And he sits on the edge of her bed, holds her little hand, and says, honey, time to get up. And as he holds her hand, she comes back through death into this life. Now that's some power right there. Didn't even cause him to sweat. Didn't even cause his brow to furrow. Honey, get up. What love. This is the ultimate parent. That's what I'm trying to show you. He says, daughter, your faith has made you well. He says to this daughter, honey, he's the ultimate parent for the little girl and for the woman. When you were little and you held your parent's hand, everything was going to be okay. Am I right about that? But it really wasn't, because your parent, like mine, were human. They made mistakes. But that's not true here. Jesus is the ultimate parent who has us by the hand, and he is willing to bring us through our darkest night. The Lord of the universe, the one whose hands scattered the stars like so many seeds, takes me by the hand and says, honey, time to get up. Why would you hurry somebody like that? Why would you be impatient with somebody like that? So how does he do it? How does he do that with me who's messed up so much? And you who've messed up more? How can he hold our hand? Somebody so pure and so holy. Well, the answer comes in his weakness. See, Paul said it this way in 2 Corinthians. He said, he was crucified in weakness, yet by God's power we live. There's nothing more frightening than for a little child to lose their parent's hand in a crowd or in the dark. Now, watch this. This is where it pays off. And yet, there was a time when Jesus hung on a cross and the whole world went dark and he lost his Father's hand. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? He lost his Father's hand so he could grab mine and yours and say, honey, time to get up. Why do we hurry someone like that? Why are we impatient with someone like that? Jesus became unclean on the cross so that I could become clean. Thomas Cranmer, who put together the the Book of Common Prayer, and he said this, "O Lord, teach us to imitate the example of his patience, that we might be made partakers of his resurrection." Jesus knew that the only way to get a crown was to go to a cross. The only way to get a resurrection was to go through death. The only way to get power was through weakness. And that's what he did. He did that so that we could arise. So, ladies and gentlemen, I say to you, it's time to wake up. Thank you, Lord. Thank you for your grace and mercy. Thank you for your impeccable timing. Thank you that you live life on eternal standard time. Oh, that I could learn to live life at the speed of Jesus. Keep pace with you, in step with you. Now, Lord, would you just speak deeply to our hearts? Would you draw us closer to you? May we hear your tender voice